You know that feeling when you're a kid and it's pouring outside, like you're cozy inside, but there's this tiny part of you that's just a little worried about what's happening out there.
Yeah.
Well, reading through these sources from Portsmouth, it's like Mother Nature just decided to skip the gentle rain and go straight for the floodgates. These stories you shared are intense. People scrambling, power flickering.
Yeah.
That unsettling feeling of the familiar becoming, well, frighteningly different.
It's one thing to hear, flash floods on the news, but you've really brought us the human side of this story, the raw, unfiltered experiences from the ground. We're not just talking about a few puddles here. This is lives completely disrupted, homes damaged, that sinking realization that things might never be quite the same.
And reading through these firsthand accounts, the city media minutes, the local news articles, one thing is crystal clear. Portsmouth is hurting. But here's where it gets even more complicated. You flagged this citizen who practically erupted at the county commissioners meeting. It felt like a breaking point. And I have to admit, I was right there with him in his frustration.
Oh, it's palpable, isn't it? That sense of just enough is enough. And what's so fascinating here is that his outburst, it wasn't just about the flood itself, but about this deeper frustration. He pointed to the city's sewer system, claiming it's been this recurring issue, a problem swept under the rug too many times.
And this time the rug's been literally washed away, revealing a much bigger mess. He wasn't just talking about some overflowing gutters, right? The sources you shared suggest significant damage, people losing belongings, the kind of impact that takes months, maybe years to recover from.
Absolutely. And this is where we see the cracks in the response, the critty. You could say a tale of two cities. You've got the city of Portsmouth, understandably focused on the immediate need, debris cleanup. But even that seemingly straightforward task hits a snag. Their transfer station, it's down. Meanwhile, the county commissioners are trying to access state aid, but they're trapped in that all too familiar web of bureaucratic red tape.
It's like everyone's trying to put out a fire, but no one's quite sure where the hydrant is, let alone who's holding the hose. And let's not forget the folks at home, the ones left picking up the pieces while this bureaucratic back and forth drags on. What struck me is how many different agencies are involved. The Emergency Management Agency, EMA, assessing damage. Job and Family Services, JFS, trying to provide food assistance. Community Action, pushing for a federal disaster declaration. It's a lot to process, especially if your world's just been turned upside down.
You're absolutely right in these situations. Just knowing where to turn for help can be as daunting as the damage itself. And this is where those seemingly small details you highlighted, they become lifelines, for example. Did you know that JFS can help with food stamp replacement if the power outage ruined perishable food? That could be the difference between a family eating or going hungry. It's those kinds of details. They often get lost in the larger narrative, but they make a world of difference when you're dealing with the immediate aftermath of a disaster. And speaking of details that got lost, let's talk about Governor DeWine's visit, the sources you shared, particularly those first-hand accounts. They suggest it didn't exactly go over well.
Yeah, his choice of words. It really rubbed people the wrong way. Talking about the situation as an inconvenience. Come on.
Yeah.
I was reading those lines out loud, and even I felt my blood pressure rising.
And that's where the disconnect becomes glaringly obvious. You've got people wading through flooded homes, sifting through debris that used to be their memories. And the governor shows up talking about inconvenience. It's almost like he's looking at a spreadsheet of damages, not into the faces of those who've lost so much.
And here's what gets me. This isn't just some random politician being out of touch. This is the governor, the guy who's supposed to be leading the charge, advocating for resources, offering comfort and support. Instead, it feels like he just poured gasoline on an already raging fire.
What's interesting here is that Governor DeWine's response didn't happen in a vacuum. Remember those county commissioners you mentioned? They're caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, they have to answer to the people, to that raw anger and frustration we saw boiling over at that meeting. But on the other hand, they're navigating the same political machinery, the same system that produced DeWine's tone-deaf response.
It's like they're being asked to bridge a chasm with a toothpick. No wonder people are at their wits' end. And while the politicians are busy playing politics, it's the ordinary folks, the middle class and good, hardworking folks, as one of your sources put it, who are left to pick up the pieces. What struck me is how vulnerable this group seems to be in these situations.
It's a sad reality, but disasters often expose the fault lines in our social fabric. You've got people who are already struggling to make ends meet, living paycheck to paycheck, and suddenly they're hit with a financial gut punch they could never have prepared for. And that's where things get really complicated.
Because it's not just about cleaning up the mess, it's about rebuilding your entire life. And let's be honest, that takes money, resources, support, things that aren't always readily available, especially for those who are already stretched thin before disaster struck.
Exactly. And we hear about, flood insurance. But honestly, it's one of those things you never think you'll need until it's too late. The sources you shared make it clear that a lot of people in Portsmouth, especially those who were already struggling, they just didn't have that extra layer of protection. And that's where the bureaucratic maze becomes almost impossible to deal with. Imagine, you're facing this mountain of debt, your home is in shambles, and now you're expected to navigate this complex web of government aid applications, each with its own set of rules and deadlines. It's enough to make anyone lose hope.
It's heartbreaking. You see these stories of resilience, neighbors helping neighbors, but then you realize there's this underlying current of frustration and exhaustion. It's like everyone's running a marathon they didn't sign up for.
Yeah, and this is where, going back to your sources, that comment from Steve Sturgill really resonated. He talked about the need to put people to work cleaning up, to rebuild not just the buildings, but the community itself. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? That it takes a disaster to create job opportunities, to remind us of the power of collective action.
And maybe that's the glimmer of hope in all of this. The floods have revealed vulnerabilities, but they've also unveiled this deep well of resilience, this determination to come back stronger. The sources you shared, even those filled with anger and frustration, they also contain this undercurrent of, we're in this together.
Absolutely. Disasters often act as this magnifying glass, bringing both the best and worst of humanity into sharp focus. We see the failures, the systemic inequalities that leave some more vulnerable than others. But we also witness these extraordinary acts of kindness, neighbors helping neighbors, communities rallying to support their own well.
It's a stark reminder that behind the headlines, behind the statistics, there are real people whose lives have been irrevocably changed. As we delve deeper into these sources, one thing becomes clear. The floodwaters may have receded, but the journey to recovery, it's far from over.
And that's where you, the listener, come in. The situation in Portsmouth is still unfolding, and it's a story that will continue to be written long after this deep dive is over. Stay informed, ask tough questions, and hold your leaders accountable. Because ultimately, the power to shape a more resilient future, it lies not just with those in positions of authority, but with each and every one of us.
You know what resonates most from this deep dive? It's the sheer strength of the human spirit. Despite the devastation, the anger, the uncertainty, the people of Portsmouth are picking up the pieces, rebuilding their lives, and demanding better from those who represent them. It's a story that reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there is always hope, always resilience, and always the power of community to light the way forward.